Hola amigos, hola amigas, esta es una nueva edición de Conversaciones Americanas. Discúlpenme un momento, pero voy a abrir ahora la entrevista que le hicimos a el doctor William Leogrande. Entonces esperen un minutico y esto lo vamos a hacer aquí. Esperen un momento. Sé qué es lo que pasó, parece que hubo algo que yo no hice bien. Un momento, por favor. Estoy buscando, esperen un minutico. Algo que yo pensé que iba a salir mejor, pero parece que no fui capaz de hacerlo bien. Voy a buscar un momentico. La entrevista es en inglés, así que me van a disculpar. Ya la estamos poniendo ya. Un segundo más. Un solo segundo más.
Was in fact to restore these kinds.
Cuba at the School of Public Policy at American University. Un minutico. Un minutico y ya empezamos. Ya estamos listos ya. Hi, we are together with Professor William Leogrande. William Leogrande is a professor at the School of Public Policy at American University. He is the author of two big books about U.S. relations with Latin America, In Our Own Backyard and Backchannel to Cuba, that he co-authored with Peter Kornbluh. Professor Leogrande is also the author of multiple articles and chapters in other books and multiple. He's a frequently quoted scholar about U.S.-Cuba relations. Professor Leogrande, welcome to Conversaciones Americanas. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and it is an honor that a scholar of your caliber has accepted to be in our program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As a scholar who had studied U.S.-Cuba relations for decades, I want to ask you, how will you frame the relations between Cuba and the United States? What are the priorities for the United States in the relations with Cuba? And what will be the main obstacle? What are the main obstacles for good relations between the two countries?
Well, you know, I think that the relationship really has two components to it, right? There's a foreign policy component, but there's also a very strong domestic policy component. Years ago, there was developed an academic framework called the two-level games, which meant that a foreign policy had to both satisfy foreign policy concerns, but it also had to be sustainable in terms of domestic politics. And what we've seen, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is that Cuba as a foreign policy has become less important to the United States and become more important as domestic politics. And that, of course, is because of the electoral power of the Cuban American community in Florida, which is always a critical state in presidential elections. And so we see American politicians sometimes pandering, frankly, to the Cuban American voter in South Florida, but always cognizant of the impact that their Cuba policy will have on those voters.
Bill, following this statement that you made, so would you consider that Obama's approach in his last 2 years of using the executive power to dismantle the embargo, or the embargo or the blockade, the way we wanted to call it, although this is a question that I want to pursue in the next question. So would you consider then that this approach at the two-level game was not sustainable?
No, I think it was. I think, the conventional political wisdom among Democrats was that you had to be tough on Cuba or else Cuban Americans would vote against you. And I think Obama recognized that the nature of the community was changing, that as more and more people came for economic reasons and maintained connections with their families on the island, there were actually more and more Cuban Americans in favor of a better state-to-state relationship because it made family ties easier, made it easier for them to travel, send remittances, and so on. And so Obama was very explicit in appealing to that moderate segment of the community. I think he recognized that, the real hardliners who want to see the overthrow of the Cuban government, they were never going to vote for a Democrat. They were always going to vote Republican, but that there was a significant component to the community that would vote for a Democrat who was in favor of engagement. And the result was he did very well, better than other Democrats ever had among Cuban Americans, both in 2008, when he got about 35% of the Cuban American vote, and in 2012, when he got 49% of the Cuban American vote. For some reason, the Biden administration has slipped back into that old belief that they have to be tough on Cuba to win Cuban American votes. I think it's a political miscalculation, frankly, and it doesn't make for good foreign policy.
This is also an interesting topic. Why, if there are plenty of evidences that these people will not vote for the Democrats, and in fact, they didn't vote for a Democrat before 2008, and Biden and his people know all these evidences. Why are they insisting on a road that in some of your articles you chose as destined to even a bigger failure for not mobilizing people that came to the ballots, came to vote precisely when they feel that there was a creative policy in between 2008 and 2009 and 2012, and between 2012 and 2016?
Well, I find it difficult to explain, honestly. It's true that some of the recent opinion polls have shown that there's been a move back among Cuban Americans toward a more hardline position, including among some younger Cuban Americans and more recent arrivals. But I think that that's really a question of leadership. You're not going to mobilize moderate Cuban Americans in support of engagement without leadership. Obama provided that leadership. Biden has not. And
exactly.
And so, I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem for the Biden administration, of course, is that they, particularly for the first 6 months, just refused to pay any attention to Cuba. Presidential press secretary Jen Psaki said it outright. Said Cuba's not a high priority for the president. And so they were focused on other things, and they just let the issue of Cuba slide. And now they find themselves in a more difficult position because of events in Cuba, and particularly the demonstrations in July 11th.
Yeah, but I will say that the people that recommend not to take actions early after the president has made the commitments during the electoral campaign to at least eliminating the most outrageous and abusive policies of Trump by missing the time, the window that he has before in the first 6 months, he basically locked himself in a position now that is more difficult. And I noticed that there is a narrative trying to blame people who are more in favor of detente and saying that they are splitting the party within the Cuban American community. But in reality, we're the most moderate, the ones who advocate a strategy of wait and see, are the responsible for splitting the party. If Biden has done the minimal steps that he proclaimed during the electoral campaign, and it was a consensus among all the Democratic candidates, with the exception of the candidate that I supported, Michael Bloomberg, was the only one that didn't say anything like that, by the way. And I said, because I supported him, and I knew that very clear. And if Biden has done what he and the other candidates had a consensus rapidly in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 months, he would not have problem with Menendez, because Menendez already support Biden, knowing that he had made those promises. He didn't have any place to go. And if he has done that, he could simply say, that was my promise, I did it, and that's the end of it.
He could have done that. And I think in retrospect, he may even wish he had done it. But as you say, now they've missed that window of opportunity, and it's more complicated now because of events in Cuba. And now there are people in the administration saying, oh, maybe the Cuban government is going to fall, and so we mustn't do anything now to help them. So we mustn't allow remittances to go. We mustn't allow travel to be restored. We mustn't reverse any of the Trump sanctions, because the sanctions are working. Cubans were in the streets protesting the government, and now the government is going to collapse. I think that's nonsense. American policymakers have been predicting the imminent collapse of the Cuban government ever since 1960, and it's still there. But this is wishful thinking on their part, but it is paralyzing the policy.
I thank you. I agree with this is the situation. Where is the problem? In the bureaucracy, in the people that he appointed in the Cuba portfolio, or it is in his own vision about the place of Cuba in the policy towards Latin America, or the policy in politics in general? Is this something is Cuba only a topic to throw as a red meat to people in Miami?
So I think it's a combination of these things. On the one hand, there's the domestic political dimension that we've already talked about. On the other hand is Biden's own personal commitment to promoting democracy and human rights. And he's framed this kind of Biden doctrine, some people call it, of the United States pushing back against authoritarianism in the world. And people who don't want to see an improvement in relations with Cuba are able to use that to appeal to him on that basis and say, well, Cuba's an authoritarian regime, and it's in difficult circumstances. We should continue to pressure it to change, and we shouldn't do anything that will take the pressure off, because this is a defense of democracy and human rights. And I think there are people in the administration, among his appointees, who in fact see things in that fashion. For example, the person on the National Security Council staff in charge of Latin America, Juan Gonzalez, has called engagement with Cuba a subversive activity. He's explicitly said that the whole point of having any engagement with Cuba is to undermine the regime.
Well, I understand that if the idea was human rights promotion, but it is very difficult to call US policy towards Cuba a human rights policy. It is clear, at least to me, that, and in your explanation come quite clear, that the administration is putting some important strategic and economic interests of the United States. They put them in the back burner, but it is not clear to me that they are sacrificing those interests for human rights. I think the explanation that you made about domestic politics is more realistic and on target. Simply, The policy that Obama proclaimed toward Cuba was a policy based on our interests and American values. And in fact, there was a record during 2 years that if you do not get obsessed with the removal of the Cuban government tomorrow, a policy of human rights will be better promoted if America engage with Cuba, try to dialogue with Cuban civil society, take into account, as it is suggested by most scholars of human rights, take into account the nationalist culture in the Cuban within the Cuban people and the history of relationship between the two countries. For many people, and this is something that I will ask you, they consider that the policy of the embargo, that many of them call a blockade, because they believe, and count me among them, that the policy of the United States towards Cuba is in itself a violation of the rights of Cubans. And it's not only me. The United Nations in the resolution called the policy of the United States counterproductive for human rights. It doesn't have the rules for a human rights policy. It doesn't assess the impact on vulnerable population. It doesn't have a sunset clause to discuss whether the policy of sanction is the optimal for promoting human rights. It harm, according to the OAS, I'm not talking even about the UN, the OAS Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, in a consultative opinion, say that the embargo or the sanctions of the United States were harming the right to food, the right to drinkable water, and several other rights, the right to health of the Cuban people. So it's clear to me, Bill, that it is a policy that sacrifices American strategic interests, but not to our values, but to some kind of domestic politics dynamics.
Well, I certainly agree with you. You can't call a policy that involves cutting off remittances to Cuban families in the middle of a global pandemic so that there's not enough food in the country. You can't call that a human rights policy.
Yeah, that's clear. In your book, Backchannel to Cuba, you quote Harry Schleiderman memo before the meeting of the OAS for about sanctions against Cuba. And he said it very clearly. He said American interest with Cuba is to put Cuba in the back mirror or something like that. I don't remember. I didn't read it yesterday or the day before, but those are among the good documents that I always highlight. In some sense, and he didn't say Cuba. When you read what he explained, is our own policy towards Cuba in the back mirror, in the back in the mirror, because it is clear that it was creating a lot of conflict, regional and globally, in terms of the relation with Cuba. In some sense, now it's worse. Every year, 184, 192. Sometimes, for even in 2016, it was only with 2 abstentions, nobody in favor of the U.S. position. So, does this demand of the international community play any role in American strategic calculation of its policy towards Cuba? Do anybody care in Washington, with power in the Biden administration that has proclaimed multilateralism an important part of its approach? Do they care about what the rest of the people think about their policy towards Cuba?
So I think the short answer is no.
No.
And I think, the evidence is that the United Nations has been voting this way for more than 20 years. And US policy hasn't changed. But the one exception I will make, though, is to say that I think that the attitudes of Latin America were very important for Obama's decision in his last 2 years to move toward normalizing relations. He went to the Summit of the Americas in Colombia in 2012. And Latin Americans unanimously sent a very clear message that if the US policy didn't change, they would not come to another summit if Cuba was not invited. And Obama was surprised at the vehemence of Latin America. And in fact, when the announcement of normalization was made in 2014, one of the things that was said explicitly by the White House was that the old policy towards Cuba was interfering in our ability to have a good relationship with the rest of the hemisphere.
So there is a summit of the America coming. Do you think that history will repeat once as a success, and secondly as a success or not a success, when now the President Biden will welcome in the United States the head of government of Latin America
We will have to see.
and Canada?
We will have to see if Cuba is invited to this summit or not. As host, the United States technically has the ability to invite or not to invite a particular country. Traditionally, of course, those invitations have been a matter of consensus among the countries. But of course, right now, because of the pandemic and because of changes in government in Latin America, you don't have the same unanimity in favor of a US policy of engagement with Cuba that you had back in 2012. You have conservative governments in Colombia, in Brazil, still in Chile, and in a few other places. But on the other hand, then you have Mexico now and Argentina pushing for a change in US policy. So there's some division in the region, but I would say that in the wake of the pandemic, most countries are more focused on their domestic problems than they are on this issue. Still, the Summit of the Americas will be a test for whether or not the administration is willing to engage diplomatically with Cuba in any significant way.
Well, Brazil is in my view, the main right-wing government today. But let's remember that the government of Juan Manuel Santos was a right-wing government, the one that hosts the summit in Cartagena, and the one that also, and in Chile, the government was the government of Piñera. Therefore, we cannot say that right-wing governments don't pay a price if they support a policy of the United States toward Cuba that is so unpopular in the region. There is another element that I would like to mention here, and I would like to ask your question. In my view, Cuba's policy in the Biden administration is adrift. What about relation with how can we call rival powers to the United States? There is a very important triangular. When you read your book, Backchannel to Cuba, you notice that there is always a very important triangular dimension in the relation.
So you froze
Okay.
there.
I will repeat it. I will repeat it. There is a very important triangular dimension in the relation between Cuba, the United States, and rival powers. We are talking about, or we are reading a lot in foreign affairs, foreign policy, the major journals of the discipline, or the policy-oriented journal, that we are in a post-Cold War by now, and that America, the unipolar moment mentioned by Charles Krauthammer is already past, and we see an assertive People's Republic of China. Russia is a power that is exercising also its political muscle. And in your book, Backchannel to Cuba, history shows that Cuba has gone for particular alliances with these countries or rivals of the United States, sometimes not out of its own will, but because it has been pushed to do so. It's a mixture of things, ideological affinities, but also it is clear that Castro, in many occasions, for instance, said that he didn't want such a close alignment with the communist bloc, and it was not an easy relation, but the policy of the United States played a very important role in this triangle. we are in a different world now. There was recently even a report by the Treasury Department about how to use sanctions. And if you read the whole recommendations, it is the Cuban case is a poster child of what not to do. The sanctions need to be multilateral. They need to be the optimal tool for the goal that you are trying to achieve. You need to have a clear goal in order to search for which sanctions you are going to use. So it is basically, as I say, a poster child of what not to do. And one of the reasons is what will be the effect on third actors. Sanctions need to be evaluated and assessed not only because of the impact on the target country, but also on the impact on third actors, and in some sense, they don't say it, but triangular dynamics. What do you think will be the effect on US policy or US relations with Europe, with Russia, or with China of the policy towards Cuba?
Well,
Yeah.
we already know that the Europeans are very unhappy with the extraterritorial elements of the U.S. embargo. In particular, some of the financial sanctions and the Helms-Burton Title III sanctions, which now, because they've been activated, allows Cuban Americans to sue European companies in U.S. courts over property that they lost in Cuba half a century ago. So the Europeans are very unhappy with this, but the United States wagers that other issues that the Europeans have with us are more important. And so therefore they will just accept the Cuba policy because other things are more important to them. I think that for the United States, the bigger cost actually comes in Cuba's relationship with Russia and China. Cuba is a small country under attack by a superpower. It's natural for it to look for support and alliance with a rival superpower. And so you can see, since the Trump administration reversed Obama's policy of engagement, a deepening of Cuba's relationship, both with Russia and with China. Russia, as you say, trying to sort of get back its global influence that it lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. China trying to assert global influence for the first time, particularly financially. And so you see China providing more support financially to Cuba and beginning to invest in Cuba. You see Russia building what they call a strategic relationship with Cuba, which goes beyond just economic assistance, but even includes now military assistance and military cooperation. So the United States basically left the field open for Russia and China to expand their relationship with Cuba. For Cuba, it would be much more valuable to have a good relationship with the United States, economically much more valuable. The United States is closer. It's a source of tourism. It's a source potentially of foreign direct investment. It's a source of trade, which is much easier and less expensive than trade, with China or with Russia for shipping costs alone. So, Cuba, following its own self-interest, would, I'm sure, rather have a close relationship with the United States, a normal relationship with the United States, rather than with these other powers. But the United States is not giving them that opportunity.
Yep, I simply agree with that. After the events of July 11, after the demonstration against the anti-governmental demonstration in Cuba in July 11, the U.S. government had adopted several targeted sanctions against Cuban officials and Cuban institutions. The question is, how can we talk about those well-targeted sanctions when in reality they are part of a comprehensive sanction approach that basically do not discriminate between those who they call responsible for human rights violation and the Cuban people at large. Is this kind of public relation stunt? Are they trying to sell us something that anybody who just poked his finger there will find that they are basically selling something that is not coherent?
Well, so first, it's contradictory, obviously, right? I mean, the Biden administration, President Biden himself has said that he thinks that comprehensive sanctions are a bad idea because the burden falls on ordinary people. I mean, that's his position. But he leaves the Cuba sanctions in place. Then after July 11, they imposed these targeted sanctions. But the problem with them is that they're largely symbolic. The targeted Magnitsky sanctions, as they're called, which are targeting individuals or groups of individuals, have two particular sanctions. One is that people are not allowed to enter the United States if they're under sanction. And if they have assets in the United States, those assets are frozen. Well, senior Cuban military officials don't have assets in the United States. Even if they did, they'd be already frozen by the embargo. And they're not about to be requesting tourist visas. So the sanctions are essentially symbolic because they don't have practical effect on the people involved. And that means that they don't have practical effect on the behavior of the Cuban government. And so they are, at best, you could say they're a moral statement on the part of the United States that we disagree with and condemn the actions of the government on July 11th. But in terms of having any beneficial effect, they have none.
I would say that they could be a symbolic or a moral statement if they were accompanied with the removal of the sanctions to the people. But in generally, they are becoming a symbol of resistance from the point of view of at least the base of the Cuban government. Because the idea is they are singling out these people as leading of a resistance rather than as violator of human rights. Because when you get into the discussion about human rights, then the rest of the sanctions come to the debate, and it's very difficult to say that one thing is separated from the other when it is the U.S. government and those who advocate even for a military intervention in Cuba, the ones that are mixing together this. I personally will not have any problem with an approach that use well-targeted sanctions. But the idea is that the combination of well-targeted sanctions with comprehensive sanctions is basically, as you call it, contradictory. I will call it oxymoronic, to say the least on this. What is the role of the economic relations and particularly the business community in the relation between Cuba and the United States? I noticed that after Obama's opening in December 17, the talk and agreement between the two governments, people put a lot of emphasis on the idea of the business community. My experience, at least, was that I went to several seminars that I was invited to talk on the issue of Cuban politics, but later there were lawyers and people that many people were very afraid of engaging with Cuba with the sanctions in place. They were afraid that later something can happen, like Trump or someone of this kind. Not only Trump, by the way, they were when I went to some of these seminars, people talk about Jeb Bush, and the idea was that you invest in Cuba, and then later you could be sued. They asked the lawyers of the State Department, and they would say, "Oh, this lasts only as an executive order. If this is removed, you will have to deal with the next administration," or something like that. It seems to me like the DACA issue with less relevance. No, what is the role of this economic business community? Should we talk, as Charles Kupchan said, that the building of peace and good relations should be the result of a strategic diplomacy before in the sequence, or we should try to create a whole some holes in the embargo and believe that an economic constituency will keep the bike moving.
So, you know, the Obama administration hoped that by poking some holes in the embargo and getting the US business community to have more of a stake in relations with Cuba, that it would make the policy irreversible, right? That's what Ben Rhodes said. And Obama did poke a lot of holes in the embargo in commercial terms. And initially, there was a lot of excitement in the US business community, right? People were streaming down there with ideas about trade and potential investments. But two things, at least, got in the way. One was when people got on the ground in Cuba and began to deal with the Cuban bureaucracy and began to look at the real economic potential of investments or trade in Cuba, they realized that it was a difficult business environment on the one hand, and that there was not huge profit to be made there. And so there was a lot of interest, but in the end, not a lot of people willing to put money on the line. There was only.
Will you say that is the Cuban government attitude, the realities of the Cuban market that is relatively or very small, 0.12, 0.12% of the global product? Or would you say that the ambivalence of holes in the embargo, but keeping the embargo as the law of the land was the most important factor?
Well, that's the other thing I was going to say, right? Is that on top of the difficulties of doing business in Cuba was this fear that you could run afoul of the embargo even as it stood then, or that the holes could be plugged by the next administration, right? And so there was uncertainty. And as we know, business people hate uncertainty. And so the idea of putting a lot of money into building a relationship with Cuba, trading with Cuba, building warehouses at Mariel, or all of those kinds of things that could have been done, and then risking that your license would be pulled after the next presidential election was very discouraging to people. And that's exactly what happened to Marriott hotels. It's exactly what happened to Marriott hotels. And so now that, of course, reinforces this concern among other business people. Business people historically have been really strong lobbyists in favor of improving relations and lifting the embargo when they have a sense that the president in office is open to it. But when you get a president like Trump, the business people sit back because they know that it's hopeless. They don't want to pound their head against the stone wall. And so they stop lobbying. It will be interesting to see with this president whether or not the business lobby sort of re-energizes itself in the hope that he might actually keep his campaign promises. Although I think every month that goes by makes it less likely.
Some people have said that Obama's policy was a failure because they didn't achieve, according to them, the goal, or they didn't a goal of rapprochement because the Cuban government was reluctant. What do you think about this type of statement? How do you assess the Obama period?
So I think that statement is just flatly wrong.
Exactly.
It's flatly wrong. I mean, first of all, in 2 years, the two governments signed 23 bilateral agreements on issues of mutual interest. So those are accomplishments. That doesn't even mention the prisoners that were released as a result of December 2014, right? December 17, 2014. In addition to that, there were ongoing dialogues about human rights, about property claims, and cooperation on a broad range of issues. It's true that the Cuban government was in some ways reluctant about cultural penetration that came about. You'll remember there was the Rolling Stones had a concert there, and then Chanel had a fashion show on the Prado, and there was a sense that the cultural impact of the United States was in some way destabilizing, and so there was some pullback in the last year or so on the cultural front. But diplomatic the diplomatic dialogue was not interrupted. In fact, it accelerated in the last 2 years. And finally, you know, the complaint that the policy failed because it didn't produce democracy in Cuba in 24 months is ridiculous, because the people who are making that argument are calling for a return to a policy of sanctions that hasn't produced change in Cuba in 60 years.
Exactly. That's correct. I remember when you mentioned that Henry Kissinger defined diplomacy or success in diplomacy as the accumulation of partial successes.
Mm-hmm.
He called it the patient accumulation of partial successes. So I think 62 years of the same policy is not, it's too much patient. But in 2 years that the outcome was different of what some people expected, I think it's a problem. And the second thing is that the goal proclaimed by Obama from the beginning was that he was negotiating with Cuba and adopting this policy. He predicated this policy on the basis of the interests of the United States, not on the idea that the Cuban government will be an accomplice on dismantling its own power in the island or something like that. I would say that. And Bill, I believe that in the fact that there was some kind of minimal rollback, because there was not a rollback of the reform, there was like a kind of pause in the reform, show the internal debate that was taking place inside the Cuban government. And it was particularly noticeable in publications. The academic community, certain segments of the government was basically saying, we need to adapt to this new situation. And there were other people that I will call it not the hardliners, but the most dogmatic defenders of the old ideology, that they were the ones that began to say that the Rolling Stones were kind of invaded. In fact, there was an author who lived outside Cuba in Canada. I don't remember now his name, Auguste, the one that said that the Rolling Stones were a cultural invasion of Cuba. In Cuba, he had some friends that were repeating this, but he was, in my view, he was the first one who came with this, I will call it baseless idea. How many countries would like to be invaded by Naomi Campbell and the Rolling Stones or things like that? I want to ask you also, what is how important in the conflict between Cuba and the United States has been legal issues of an international character, let's say international law, but also issues that are related to the nationalizations of properties by the Cuban government in the early 1960s.
Well, so as you know, the Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation passed in 1996 gives Cuban Americans, and well, actually anyone in the United States who lost property after the revolution, but it's especially aimed at Cuban Americans. It gives them the right to sue in US federal court anyone who is quote unquote trafficking in that property. So what does that mean? Well, anybody who's benefiting from it in any fashion. So right now there's a lawsuit of the person whose family owned what is now Jose Marti International Airport. And he is suing airlines who are landing at Jose Marti International Airport for trafficking in his family's property. And those airlines are now required to defend themselves in federal court. What this law...
What about travel insurances? Because if you travel to Cuba and you use a travel insurance, you could be also called a trafficker, no? If the idea is anybody who benefit, if the idea is anybody who benefit.
The insurance companies now are U.S. owned, so that's not a problem. But but the point of this, the point I want to make here is that the presumption in this law, Helms-Burton, is that the Cuban state does not have the sovereign right to nationalize its own property, to nationalize property of Cuban citizens. So it is at a fundamental level a denial of Cuba's sovereignty. And because have the right, because people who are litigants have the right to sue European companies for business they do in Cuba that has nothing directly to do with the United States, it's also a denial of the sovereignty of European countries. So it is this kind of paternalistic idea that other countries' sovereignty doesn't count when the interests of the United States are at stake. And of course, with regard to Cuba, this has been an attitude ever since the Platt Amendment.
Well, in international relations theory, we call that an imperial policy. It's hard to say it, but if this type of denial of other actors' sovereignty, it's typical of empires. And it's clear that the world, the way the world is changing, it is not in the interest. If the idea that many people in the Biden administration are saying that this is the moment to create the rules of the game that will allow America to be to have a friendly world when it is not on top, I think that this idea of behaving as an empire is not the optimal. If your idea is, and you are assuming that there is another rising power that might compete or at times even be more powerful in economic, political, even military terms, I wonder how you can say that if you apply some type of coherence, when China behave in similar ways, let's say in the South China Sea, or saying, you know what, this belongs to me because I am the most powerful actor here, what will be the main difference between doing so and what the United States do in the case of Cuba, or Russia and Georgia and things like that. In your book, Backchannel to Cuba, there is also a great role. You can see a great role for discussion about sports, the Orioles game, the Preston Gomez, and I don't remember now the manager, the president of the big leagues at the time of Kissinger, during Carter, the baseball games. There was an agreement between Cuba and the United States, between the Cuba and the major leagues, even during the Trump administration, but Bolton and the National Security Council, it said that they rejected. What role do you see not in a post-pandemic, because scenarios are very complex, but what role do you see to this type of novel things, such as academic exchanges, sport games? What will be the problem for, let's say, begin to apply the agreement between Cuba and the major leagues?
Well, I think we should. I mean, I've always felt that.
No, I understand. I ask you, in your view, which is the argument that is presented by this administration not to move in these areas?
Well, they haven't presented any argument.
Oh, they
haven't presented any. I mean, and in fact, one of the things Biden promised to do during the campaign was, in fact, to restore these kinds of people-to-people connections. But they've done nothing, absolutely nothing. And it's a shame, because I think that those kinds of civil society linkages, if you will, around culture, around art, around sports, around academic exchanges, build a kind of understanding among people that can be the foundation for reconciliation between governments. Because then there's a push from the bottom up, right, on the governments to find a way to reconcile. And they benefit both countries. They benefit both countries. There's no downside to these kinds of exchanges. And that's why, we've been doing them ever since the Carter administration. But Trump cut them off almost entirely, made them almost impossible. And now the Biden administration is sitting on its hands doing nothing to restore them.
In an article for Foreign Affairs in 2016, in the middle of his personal tragedy with the death of his son Bo, that eventually led to President Biden not to run in the 2016 election, then Vice President Biden wrote that it is time for American leadership in transnational, non-ideological threats. And he put as example American leadership in the struggle against the Ebola pandemic in West Africa. We have not seen this type of leadership in the Caribbean. If you even take even the example that the then vice president used, part of this leadership was to put ideological topics aside and cooperate with Cuba in the struggle against the Ebola pandemic. I'm simply using his own example. Why do you think that the administration has been so slow responding to Cuban offers for help and coordinated action against the COVID-19 pandemic in the region of the Caribbean?
Well, there's no easy explanation for it, because President Biden has said himself that the United States has a moral obligation to help defeat the pandemic around the world, and that no one is safe until everyone is safe from this pandemic. And yet, when it comes to Cuba, Cuba is different, and Cuba is not treated as a potential partner. For example, right, the administration offers to give Cuba vaccine. Well, Cuba doesn't need vaccine. Cuba needs the syringes to administer vaccine, but we don't offer that. We don't provide that. So there is an inexplicable inability of this administration to take any positive step toward Cuba, even one that would be completely in line with its own policies elsewhere. And I mean, I have heard no examples, for instance, of cooperation between the United States and Cuba in response to the latest earthquake in Haiti. In the earthquake that hit Haiti back in 2010, there was good cooperation on the ground between Cuban doctors and US personnel providing supplies. And we provided supplies to staff the Cuban hospitals that were set up by Cuban doctors on the ground in Haiti. And it made a huge difference to the Haitian people. There's no reason we couldn't be doing that again, or could not have done that again in response to the most recent earthquake in Haiti. And yet we did nothing.
Well, we are basically closing the time, closing the interview. I want to ask you two final questions. One is about an article that you wrote recently, or I would say a couple of years, 3 years perhaps, I think it was for Diplomatic History, in which you argue that the rhetoric of the two governments, and particularly when you were studying American policy towards Cuba, Fidel Castro rhetoric was more important than we previously thought from reading other narratives about the breaking of the relationship, because the United States government felt that it was a kind of treatment that they cannot afford to allow. In fact, you basically, I would say, argue that this was perhaps more important than the land reform or concrete measures that happened there. How important do you think has been the control in both sides on the rhetoric? Because I imagine ways that the Cuban government could have been more cantankerous. I don't know if this is the right word, more cantankerous about many of the things that the administration has done. And frankly, I think that the Biden administration is doing everything possible not to put the Cuba issue on the media, and the declarations from the administration are also not as loud as they could do, given the course of policy that they are pursuing. But on the other hand, I say Cuba, to be noticed, sometimes has to make this noise, and obviously this will have cost for both sides. There is a time limit to this idea of keeping the rhetoric low about this issue. And the second is a personal question. Why someone like you, that you don't have a Cuban origin or anything like that, what got your interest of a life? Because it seems, I'm not saying that you are old, you are quite young, but you begin quite young also. But I say it's a life dedicated to the study of Cuba and the relations between Cuba and the United States with a significant level of objectivity and academic integrity on your part.
Well, thank you. I'll answer the personal question first, which is that when I was in graduate school, I was interested in comparative politics and politics, the dynamics of politics in other countries. But I was also interested in the impact of the United States on U.S. foreign policy, and particularly in Latin America. And so I found the combination. Cuba was a great combination of those two things, right? On the one hand, the revolutionary regime in the 1970s, very interesting internal political dynamics, very similar in some ways to the dynamics of other communist countries, but also, very Cuban, so very different in that regard. But also the impact of the United States. You can't study Cuban politics without studying the impact of the United States and understanding U.S. foreign policy historically and right up to the present. So it was that combination that intrigued me, I guess, I would say. In terms of the rhetoric, the Cuban government started out at the beginning of the Biden administration very hopeful. A number of officials made very hopeful comments about, expecting change soon and expecting, the president to keep his promises and for the relationship to get back on track. And as nothing happened, they became more and more frustrated, and you can see it in the rhetoric. And whereas I will have to say, I'm sorry to say, today I think they have given up on the Biden administration. President Diaz-Canel gave a speech to the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party just a week or two ago, and another speech to the a week ago, another speech to the National Assembly just a couple of days ago, in which he was very harsh in terms of characterizing the policies of the United States, and very harsh, especially about the role that the U.S. Embassy has been playing, providing support to the dissident community on the island. It's a kind of rhetoric that we had not seen since the worst period of the Trump administration. So it signals that the Cuban leadership has decided the Biden administration is hopeless and is not going to do anything positive. And so they are much less restrained in their rhetoric. Obviously, this doesn't help the atmosphere of the relationship, but I will say the Biden administration, some people in the Biden administration have been equally responsible for this rhetorical escalation, particularly after July 11th, with some of the rhetoric coming out of the administration. One of the things that made Obama a success was that he treated Cuba rhetorically as a sovereign equal country. Not one that we always agreed with, obviously. He was, in his speech that he gave to the Cuban people when he visited Havana, he was very clear about things about the Cuban system that he disagreed with and the importance of democracy and human rights.
In fact, Bill, contrary to the narratives that has been circulating in Miami and Washington, he was not apologetical at all about American values. And on
Not
the
a bit.
opposite, he used the opportunities of engagement to speak about American values in a clear and with no apologies whatsoever.
That's right. And he did it in a respectful way in the
A
following
respectful
sense.
way.
He spoke to the Cuban people and he said, we value democracy, we value human rights, and here's why we do. Because our country has been imperfect, and it has been democracy that has allowed us to get better. It's made it possible for the people to demand better of their leaders. And so he framed it in terms of our experience here in the United States forming the values that we have, rather than lecturing the Cubans about what they ought to do. The United States has been lecturing Cuba about what it ought to do ever since 1898. And Cubans, understandably, are sick of hearing it from us. They want to be able to decide for themselves how to govern Cuba. So I'm sorry to say, I think the Biden administration has gone back to an older time of rhetoric, which is more paternalistic and dismissive of Cuba and insulting, frankly, to Cuba. And it doesn't produce results.
And scholarly has been demonstrated, and I think the Cubans are not full on that this is not only paternalistic, but it's self-serving paternalistic narrative. It's not that, let's say, why there is no narrative about the January 6 events in our country. It's something that anybody who come, and I think that, as you said, a merits of Obama narrative is that it begins by saying we are not perfect. And we have this system because this system provides opportunities for solving those problems. It doesn't build the United States as the model that everybody else has to follow. And I think this is quite important when we see this type of conversation. By the way, you are in good company because, for instance, people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., he mentioned at times that the emphasis should be in that when he talked about the Bay of Pigs, and I think you know, he said the most important thing that they have democracy in their own terms, rather than going there or doing things that not only undermine their democracy, but also undermine our commitment to international law, etc. Bill, it has been a great pleasure to have you here. You are more than welcome anytime you want to come back to Conversaciones Americanas. Today has been a great opportunity. The only thing that I can say is that with all gratitude that you will be welcome every time you want to come and have a conversation of this kind again.
Well, thank you, Arturo. It's been a great pleasure and a lot of fun talking with you.
Yeah, okay. I hope that we can repeat it. Bye.
Bye now.